Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you so much for tuning into one of our talks today. Today, we're incredibly lucky to be joined by the fantastic Joshua Jackson to talk all about his latest TV show, Dr. Death. And the first thing that I wanted to dive into talking about is you are playing a real character, but it's also interesting because the majority of audiences watching it don't have a clear set idea of him because there's a lot of information about him, but it's not like we're all familiar with how he talked, how he moved, what his voice is, and all those sort of aspects, which I imagine must give you a lot of latitude and freedom in creating a character. But within that freedom and latitude, I was really interested in where you wanted to set parameters and where you felt that it was really important to remain incredibly true to some of the more specific details of crafting him as a character.
Well, one, that's a great observation, because that's exactly right. So when we got in, once I got into the job and we got into the conversation of sort of building out who this guy was going to be, we went from 100% fidelity, right? He himself spoke with a little bit of a lisp. We played around with putting the lisp in there. His body shape was specific over the course of time to, like, let's say 80% latitude, right? Of and trying to find the places in there. So for me, the boundaries and parameters were more emotional than they were physical, because you're exactly right. People who have paid attention to this case and story will probably have a still image recollection of Christopher Duntsch. But he is thankfully not such a well-renowned or well-known person that there isn't an impression in most people's mind's eye of like how he moves through space, how he talked, how he walked. So what then became important for me was, and what I just from a character is the more interesting part, is not necessarily the physicality of the man, even though that tells part of the story, is trying to understand the twisted emotional core of this man, and then using all the other tools, hair, wardrobe, body size, gait, voice, all of those other things to assist in telling the story. So for instance, we go back to when he was 19 and 20 years old. So when Christopher Duntsch was that age, he was an athlete, right? So he was quite a bulky guy. But for me and for Patrick McManus, the story was better told to go from as skinny a body as I can get to as bulky a body as we could get away with, rather than going from a bulky body to a bulkier body, right? So we took latitude in places like that, and definitely use the tool. Like when we go back into that earlier portion, I pitched my voice higher for that half of the episode, and changed my gait, was just generally sort of looser in my body, and used all those tools, but it always in service of the story rather than trying to like make a Xerox copy of the man.
Yeah. And overall in the telling of the story, in looking at these cases, these surgeries that he botched where he was maiming people and people had passed away, I know that it was really important to Patrick McManus that always be very true to their stories and it not overemphasize and over elaborate, and even the surgery scenes being really, really spot on. And with the fact that part of your research for those scenes was to shadow surgeries and to be in the room, what was it that you really took away from that experience, even just in terms of watching the environment in the room, watching how the doctors move, that you then were able to carry through to those scenes in really keeping every single aspect so true to how you wanted to tell those details of the story?
So I think sometimes as storytellers, we lose faith in our own stories. And I have certainly worked on shows where you get so close to the material that you lose contact with how shocking or emotionally impressive an event inside of the story might be. And so I think for Patrick, it was a very wise choice that he recognized that surgery for 99% of people is shocking on its face. And then as it turns out, spinal surgery, which I don't know, in my imagination before getting into this process, was like a very delicate thing where you go in and you don't touch anything. It's like, I remember that game when we were a kid, like don't touch the edges. But spinal surgery is violent, right? You're going deep into the meat of a body and you're dealing with very thick, heavy bones. So as you're manipulating them or inserting things into them or putting screws into them, you have to use an amount of force. So one of the things that I took out of just shadowing the surgeries was, oh shit, we don't need to gild the lily here, right? I'm a human and I'm on the outside and I'm looking at you do the right thing, right? The outcomes from the surgeries that I observed were all good, thank God. But, you know, you look at it, you're like, oh my God, this is it going well? Like, it's shocking. So using his instincts to not feel like we had to overplay those things was a beautiful parameter, because then all I needed to do was spend the time shadowing, learning terminology, hand positioning for our surgical tech was incredibly important, because that's, he said, really the biggest giveaway inside of any film surgical scenario is usually hand positions of the surgeons, because it's a very specific prescribed sort of balletic dance of how things get passed around. But that ultimately becomes, you know, in that instance, you're using props and blocking to tell the story, and you don't, you know, other than using some sort of body English and occasionally like where you pitch your voice to sort of to describe through voice the tension that's in the scene, the scenario of the scene does most of the work for you as an actor, right? You don't have to pitch it to the back wall because it's already intense. So those ones, I actually found the surgeries from a storytelling standpoint to be some of the easiest pieces, because they already have so much going on and there's so much story just visually for the audience to take in that you don't really need to add many more layers to it.
Yeah. And with him as a character in the show and as a real person as well, it's very clear that he is the hero of his own story, and he really believes every single thing that he's saying out loud and selling to people, even down to the point when we get to those later episodes where there's court trials and he's sitting in the room during these depositions, and his friend Jerry, who's now a paraplegic, is standing up there and recanting what happened from his surgery. And for you, that's a really interesting specific choice to make through your performance. And was there any moment where you and Patrick discussed whether you wanted to allow him to consider the possibility of anyone coming and saying, you know, this actually isn't true, this isn't working, this isn't right, you don't have the skill set and what you believe in? Or was it important to really keep it always at that 100% level for him?
I mean, we talked about it a lot, because there are several scenes inside of the course of the total arc where his behavior and reactions seem really odd, right? Because he's missing that empathetic piece, because he doesn't have the ability to see himself inside of the story as anything other than the hero. Like you said, he oftentimes does not act in what we would call like a normal human fashion. And we definitely had conversations over the course of time while we were there where, you know, something would strike him, or I would be in the middle of a scene and I would be, you know, sort of feeling emotionally not quite centered. And we always ended up coming back to, no, you can't let the veil down, because one, if you do that, it might make the scene easier to do, but it ultimately dilutes the character, which makes the story less poignant. And then at the end, there is this one moment in the courtroom at the very, very end where the penny starts to drop for him, and he starts to allow in the possibility that he is actually the problem. And to me, I was like, you know, we always came back to, let's save that moment. If we sell out, if we take a shortcut somewhere along the way, it's going to lessen the impact of that. And, you know, I want that to have as much weight and power as it possibly can. And also, because there is not really, you know, there are good guys in the show, but there's no amount of justice that can really be vindicating, I think, for an audience member. So at the end of the day, putting him in jail doesn't really solve any of the problems. It removes him from society, which is good, but it doesn't heal any of the people that he hurt. It doesn't fix any of the problems, the chaos that he created. So ultimately, the only real sort of like moral victory that the audience gets is, oh, he knows now. He has to live with that. And we wanted to preserve that for the end.
Yeah. And there's such an interesting journey in terms of the development of his ego, because the show does such a great job at the how and the why he became this version of himself in the end, and kind of how the system enabled that, because I think you've talked extensively about how the system was actually doing everything that it was supposed to do. It wasn't a filtering in the system, it was just a filtering in him. And by having that ability to follow the trajectory, going back to college, going back to his family life, looking at who he was as a surgeon right at the beginning when things started going wrong, but then how the more he got away with things, the more he really just believed his own hype even further. How did you want to carry that journey of self-ego from what starts out as just, slightly overinflated to this God complex at the end?
Right. Well, to me, he's a horrifying and fascinating human being because he is an outlier cautionary tale for what happens when we let our ego get away with us, get away from us. And it was such an interesting thing for Patrick to choose to do, to put, the devil at the center of his show. Right. And for me, I always wanted to introduce constantly the possibility of sliding doors, right? Like if he had just done this one other thing, if like this choice here, or he hadn't bumped into this person at this moment in his life, which is the story of all of our lives, right? We're the accumulation of things that we do and happen to us. And I thought, as we got deeper into the character creation, I also started to understand, or at least in my head, what the weight gain actually represented, which was, to me, as his psychological house of cards got harder and harder to maintain, and because he couldn't conceptualize of himself as the bad guy, he started to internalize all of that negative energy that was around him and literally carried it on his body. And that's true to the man. I mean, he ballooned up and has only gotten larger in prison. And to me, that's indicative of somebody who there's a psychological disconnect inside of that, right? And I think he's eating for comfort and to not have to deal with the world around him. And that to me was an interesting part of the journey as well. Like, how do we represent that this guy is feeling the pressure, even if he's not conscious of the pressure? And how does that manifest itself? And for him, it manifests itself in more and more egregious outbursts, right? Which I think is very true to the narcissistic personality type, that they have it's part of the narcissistic personality type that a narcissist lashes out whenever they're confronted with something that doesn't jive with their self-conception. And for him, it was paired with, as he started to tumble down from his own high pedestal, he literally internalized all of that and carried the weight on his body as he moved through.
Mm-hmm. And with those moments where he's lashing out, I feel like you start to really build a lot of tension and a lot of that anxiety in moments in your performance where things are starting to close in on him, and we feel that constriction that's coming closer and closer. And a lot of that also is played out through his drug usage. Did you have a sense going into your performance for a lot of those scenes of, okay, this is how far I'm going to push it for this moment. Okay, these are the external forces around him, so we're going to take it a little bit further? Or was a little bit of that playing around in some of the scenes and really feeling it out in the moment when you were shooting?
I mean, I like to have, especially when you were talking about like a long form narrative, we have 8 hours of time to tell the story. So I personally, not everybody likes to work like this, but I like to have a pretty clear roadmap of what it is that I want to do in various places and how best to support the story over the sort of mile posts of the entire season. And then, once that work is done, and once I've laid out the framework for, roughly where I think we should be or how any scene should play, then the beauty of doing the job is that you get to do it with other people. So, the environment plays a character, the other actors play a character, the director, all of these things come in. So I guess I sort of build myself a wide box, and then we narrow it down on the day on set. But there were definitely, there were 4 or 5 scenes over the course of the probably more than that, over the course of the season, that I had really clear opinions of, like, this is when you start to see a crack, or this is when you see the death of his innocence, or there are places from which the character is changed forever, right? There's scenes and accumulation, and then there's an event, and from that event he's a different man going forward. So there was definitely those mileposts that I had a more precise idea of what it was that I wanted to do.
Yeah, and the aspect of getting to see his friendship with Jerry, it also gives us a lot of aspects into him as a character as well, because obviously all of these surgeries are quite shocking, but the fact that he willingly performed malicious surgery on his friend and then just walked away and never spoke to him again is quite shocking to watch. And when we look at the dynamic that you and Dominic Burgess created from those early scenes where it's just the two of them hanging out, they're going to strip clubs, and then there starts to become this kind of power imbalance between the two of
Yeah.
them when once it becomes also a working professional relationship, and then we reach the point where he's just discarded. That's such a huge loop of trajectories for the two of you to carry. And I know that you didn't have very much time together before filming, so how did the two of you find a lot of those different rhythms and spaces that you needed to carry this dynamic into?
Well, so we had not a ton of time. We had a little bit of time. We had some Zoom rehearsals, which was the way things happened this time. And thankfully Dominic's just very good, and he's also a lovely man. So, we talked. He had spent his time like doing his work on Jerry, so he had a very clear opinion of who Jerry was for him. And then we just talked about the power dynamics, right? Oftentimes as actors, I think we get too precious about just having open communication. We don't want to step on toes. And I'm a big believer in getting it all out on the table, even if you're wrong, even if the other person disagrees. It builds a shared understanding of the thing that you're trying to do. And I think for Duntsch, that relationship with Jerry, the relationship with Wendy, and the relationship with his father all sort of are of a piece. I think his need to be loved and his inability to love himself manifested itself in a bunch of different ways. His need to be approved of by his father then bleeds out into his relationships with women. He doesn't really understand how to, he doesn't understand what a healthy dynamic with another woman would be. And with Jerry, the power dynamic in my mind actually flips over the course of it. When he and Jerry first meet up, he's at his lowest point. He doesn't know what he's doing. And Jerry actually is, in his way, a man about town and has a community and a social structure, which he invites Duntsch into. And then obviously over the course of that relationship, and this is to me very much Christopher Duntsch working out his daddy issues on Jerry. He needs to dominate that male figure, right? He can't have a co-equal relationship with Jerry, and he certainly can't have a subservient relationship with Jerry. He needs to be able to like overcome him and be the boss. And even though he only discards him at the moment, at that critical moment post-surgery, that relationship I think was going to founder anyway, because in the same way that Duntsch was willing to throw away Wendy, right? Once he had taken control of that relationship and it was no longer a challenge, it was no longer interesting because it wasn't flattering to him to dominate that person anymore.
Yeah. And jumping back to the court scenes, I wanted to talk about that a little bit more, because it sounds like there are audio tracks of the depositions, which you had the opportunity to listen to. And at the same time, a lot of those depositions are other people talking, not necessarily Christopher Duntsch talking. And so even just from the things that other people were saying about him, the way that they were describing the surgeries, how did that help you flesh out certain scenes preceding the court trial scene in the show?
So I had only the written text of testimony in the trial and the patient's depositions, but I did have the audio track of Duntsch's. The first time he got brought in, if he had just shut his mouth, he probably would have done a lot better. And he talked voluminously, and it was a great resource in putting himself in prison. But even in text form, the testimony at the trials is heartbreaking and painful to read and incredibly poignant. And you see people, grappling with, or sort of midstream grappling with the new reality of their life, which is nothing, that this thing that has been done to them cannot be undone. And there's no amount of money that can fix that problem. And truly, there's no amount of punishment for Chris Duntsch that can fix that problem. And they're in each of their individual ways just trying to grapple with their new reality. And those scenes were certainly some of the hardest to play, because it's very difficult to not empathize in that space. It's very difficult to not react as a human being and just think, oh my God, these poor people have been permanently damaged and disfigured by this man who I am playing. And to have a sort of lizard-like response where you filter everything through either they're betraying me or they're lying or whatever nonsense he needed to tell himself to sort of keep himself as the good doctor. Yeah, psychologically, those places were really difficult because it just, that is the space to me where you finally see he's all the way out to lunch.
Well, one of the other moments where you really see that he's all the way out to lunch is when he's in conversation with his trial lawyer and she's saying, why don't we talk about the fact that you weren't trained properly? Let's use that as a defense mechanism. And his response is, oh, that's not acknowledging my legacy. That's going to destroy my legacy that he thinks he has. And when you looked at certain details like that, were moments like that in the scripts really key to just showing you exactly how far he'd taken this in his own mind?
Well, exactly. So there's several of those things that along the way, and those scenes, absolutely, when you read them, when you have the benefit of knowing the end of the story at the start, back to sort of the question you were asking before of do you ever cheat and make a shortcut in a scene which diminishes ultimately the ending? And the answer was so clearly no, because my hope would be that this performance and the show works in both directions, right? When you watch it the first time, it's cumulative and you get to the end and you go, oh my God, what a journey this has been. But then if you either watch it a second time or think back over the time, all of the pieces, all of the bricks should actually add up to that ending. And I really didn't want to cheat him because at the end of the day, it makes him, to me, less scary, right? If he was conscious of the terrible things that he was doing, he's just an evil person. And that to me is a cop out, right? Just like I don't think he was a drug addict and that's why he was a bad surgeon. He was a bad surgeon and he was a drug addict. And I didn't want to make him easy at any step along the path for the audience.
Yeah. And when you were filming that scene right at the end where it's just the camera coming closer and closer and tracking in on him and there's no dialogue in that moment, what was the journey of filming that scene and really figuring out what it was that you externally wanted to display from everything that he's internally processing by that point in his journey?
So I really specifically, once I knew what the shot was, and we had talked about this in the lead up to doing it, it's so unnerving when a person looks you dead in the eye and doesn't blink. It's so inhuman. And so the whole Megillah for that shot for me, I was like, I just want to sit here. And for as long as I can possibly do it, I want you to just push in and I'm just going to look like a lizard at this camera and not blink. And I, more than like where my head was at or, the body position was important, but more than anything else, that was the thing that was important to me. I was like, I promise you, this is going to be so unnerving if we can just push in on this sad, bloated face without blinking. It's like icky. It feels like someone's staring through you rather than at you.
I also wanted to ask you about some of the ways in which you worked with Patrick McManus, because it sounds like he's a real rarity in the fact that he is someone who, when looking at a role like this, which is so demanding emotionally, physically, is a 5-month shoot inhabiting a character like this for a story like this, that Patrick was someone who could kind of sense when there needed to be a break, when you need to step away from a scene and come back into it to be able to give exactly what you need from your performance. And that's not something that most directors, most executive producers often do on set. And so how did that really change the experience of working on this show, having someone that was so keyed in and attuned to what you needed as a performer throughout?
Well, I mean, I think Patrick is kind of a one of one. He's certainly unique in my work life. And what it started from was frankly respect, right? I find often when I get into silly arguments with executive producers about minutia, it's often because they're making ego-driven choices that are about winning the battle but losing the war. Because ultimately, my job is not to tell the whole story. My job is to tell my piece of the story. And if I'm doing my job properly, at the point at which I'm putting something on camera, I should know more about what this person is and is doing and why he's doing it and where he's been and where he's going than anybody else on that set or in post, right? So I've had many hundreds, possibly thousands of conversations over the course of my career where somebody is making a shortcut choice, right? Somebody is making an in the moment choice that is not in service of the total storytelling. So when I say respect, Patrick is very respectful, and I think it's partially because he was an actor, but he's very respectful of actors, right? So his ability to be open and listen inside of those conversations creates a sense of like trust, which is a nice thing with an executive producer. And then it works in the opposite direction. By the time we got to shooting, I had a whole host of ideas and things I wanted to do and this and that and the other thing, not all of which worked. And I had a basis of trust with Patrick to be able to sort of, okay, here's my 10 ideas for the day. And for him to know the story backwards and forwards and always to be responsible for the broader story, so that when he said, no, that doesn't work because it does X, Y, and Z thing in this episode, to have the trust to be like, okay, I defer to you on that. I believe on you on that. Or we're shooting this in this way, so that doesn't translate. It needs a different body position, or it needs whatever the minutia would be. It was a really unique, wonderful working relationship. I mean, you know, normally it takes an amount of time to work up to that place of trust with somebody. I think there's also an extreme resistance to listening to actors inside of our business, unfortunately. Like very often people regard what we have to say or our opinions on things as coming out of ego or vanity. And it does sometimes, but the reality is like, you've hired me specifically to help you, to aid in telling your story. And all I want to do is have the story be as good as it can possibly be, because that makes me look good. And so at the end of the day, if you won't trust me to say, like, believe I've been doing this for a long time, this is the way that I think I can help tell this piece of the story the best without robbing something from later on. You need to sometimes just like back off and let me do it.
And with the fact that it was a long shoot and certain weeks, especially because of COVID shutdowns and protocols were quite heavy. You know, there was one week that was about 40 pages of dialogue in a week, which is huge and, you know, kind of almost feels insurmountable to manage to shoot that in just 1 week. When you have those moments where it is just those really insurmountable challenges, those really long days, or those moments where it just, you feel emotionally drained towards the end of the day, but you still have to bring something into a scene and figure it out and make choices. How do you navigate those types of hurdles in the moment of really finding what it is that you need and kind of pulling it together within yourself?
Well, in the normal course of business, that's what I get paid to do, right? So that's my job, is to like find the way. But I will say that on this job, that one week you're talking about in particular was December of last year. And it was just an insane amount of like emotional gymnastics and also a lot of words and just a lot. And to Patrick's credit and to the production's credit and like to my benefit, when we got on the Thursday, let's say, when I hit a wall where my brain just kind of melted down and I stopped being able to speak English, we shut down. We went home, like at the end of that day, whatever it was, hour 12, hour 14. And I was like, nope, this is the end. Like there's no good is going to come out of just doing this. So why don't we come back and like, you can go have a good night's sleep and come back and we'll like do this again tomorrow, which is unfortunately not the way that it normally happens in our business. I mean, there's so many perverse incentives in the way that we set these things up, right? At the end of the day, if the show sucks, it doesn't matter how much money you save, the show sucks and it will fail. And we very, very often wedge ourselves into these places where, you know, I have definitely done mediocre work in the 16th hour of the 200th day on a show. And it's unfortunate because, you know, it diminishes the the enjoyment of the audience, which is ultimately what we're making this thing. It diminishes the quality of the thing that we're trying to do. It makes everybody on set very unpleasant to be around because nobody likes feeling like they're doing bad work. And, you know, I'm not an accountant, but I'm pretty sure that the line item of whatever that, you know, it's sometimes expensive choices, but like that 50 grand that you saved at the end of the day is not a savings when you destroyed an episode inside of an arc. And, you know, Patrick was at, you know, responsible to the money. I know because I was there for some of them. He had a lot of difficult conversations over the course of this, but protected his story in a way that I thought was really noble. You know, really made, instead of making the penny wise pound foolish choices that productions often make, really preserved his story. And I think you can see that quality at the end of the day. I think, you know, I'm very proud of the work that we all did on this. And I think you can see that even with the constraints of COVID and the shutdowns and all of that other stuff that was going on, he kept his story over and above all of that. And like, that was his shining light that he fought for and fought for and fought for.
Yeah, it's so wonderful to hear all of that and that it was this really special experience, because I think you're absolutely right. Like, it really pays off in what we get to see on screen in terms of both your performance and also the way that this story was told. And so congratulations on everything with this show. And thank you so much, Joshua.
Thank you for having me. This was lovely.